What's going on, everybody? Stained Glass Assassin back from the dead. It has been a long time. Got stuck working swing shifts, close, open, open, close. Ugh, that was terrible. So I'm not doing that anymore, so I got some more free time. So I want to get back to making some content. I'm really excited. But one of the things I have to do first is I have to conclude Death of Comic Book Guy. I did issues 1 through 4 and then just kind of vanished, not doing number 5. So that's what we're going to cover today. No more talking. Let's just get into it. Death of Comic Book Guy, issue number 5. Alrighty, let's get into the final issue of The Death of Comic Book Guy. Now, there's a lot in this issue. I mean, it's still 26 pages like the previous issues, but there's a lot of dialogue, a lot of panels, and I'm not going to cover every panel just like I haven't for the previous 4 issues. I'll just kind of cover the ones that drive the story forward and encourage you to go back and reread the other issues, because that's what I really want you to do. I want you to experience this whole thing as, as one whole series. But anyway, let's just jump into it. Things start off, we get a nice eerie picture of Grandpa dressed up like the Grim Reaper. I really like that picture. A little one part Simpsons, one part kind of Tales from the Crypt. Kind of evil. I like it. Anyway, Bart starts off by saying, "Why did we bring Grandpa again?" And Grandpa responds, "Because you need someone who can talk to dead people, and I live with folks who are almost there." So he goes on and he says, "Oh, Spirit, we ask you to reveal yourself." And off panel, a noise occurs, and Ralph becomes startled and says, "Did you hear that?" And a skeptical Lisa responds, "No, I didn't, Ralph, because there's nothing to hear. There are no such thing as ghosts." "Then you should tell him that," Ralph responds, and everyone turns, and lo and behold, Comic Book Guy appears, covered in some sort of white goo. He enters the room, crashes through the table, and sends everyone running out. We next take a trip to the hospital, and we see Comic Book Guy laid up in the bed, and Dr. Hibbert says that he's in terrible shape. But he's always been in terrible shape, and considering that he was burned to death the last time we saw him, I'd say this is quite an improvement. Aside from the coma, he's in the best shape of his life. So Bart speculates that could he have a healing factor like Wolverine? And of course, in classic Chief Wiggum style, he says only one way to find out: let me shoot him. So of course they prevent him from shooting him, but Chief Wiggum says, there's just one thing I don't understand: everything. Now at this point, this is where Lisa prepares to lay out all her theories about what happened to Comic Book Guy, how he came back to life and whatnot, and she makes this announcement, gather around and I'll explain it. Of course, a little comedic relief. She says, "Anybody have to use the bathroom, go now, because I don't want to have to stop in the middle of the story." And of course, everybody has to run off to the bathroom, so. She begins by saying there's no easy way to say this, but Comic Book Guy was buried alive. And we get a shot inside the casket, and we see Comic Book Guy laying there, and he says, "Well, this isn't so bad. It's just like being thrown into a locker in high school. Remember what it says on your wristband. What would Batman do? I need to get me a WWBD band." So it says that from what we found from the coffin, we can only assume that Comic Book Guy kicked the bottom out of it, planning to use it as a tool to dig his way to the surface. And you see, as if a common zombie can do this, it couldn't be all that hard. But unbeknownst to Comic Book Guy, he was buried near a pipe. He cracks the pipe, and we find out that the pipe was delivering concentrated milkshake mix to the nearby Krusty Burger. You remember the one that was put up near the cemetery in the second issue. And of course, we see that it says all of Krusty's milkshakes are piped in from a plant 2 states over where the main ingredients are legal. And I really like this picture, this panel here, because aside from the pipe being all, twisted around the cemetery, if you watch the cartoon, every time they scroll through someone's house or they, scroll through the earth, like showing people going down to a bunker, or like the episode where they go to Australia, they go all the way through. They always have that biopsy cut where you can see in between, and there's always cool things in there, like skeletons or coffins or treasure chests, just like in this picture, or spaceships and things. So this was a nice homage to the cartoon itself. So that was pretty cool. Anyhow, it goes on to say that the freezing liquid leaked into the coffin, and he says, "Add a cheeseburger and fries, and this is how I wanted to die." But the comic book didn't perish. The ice-cold milkshake put him into a state of hypothermia, keeping him barely alive. Now, what we get here is we have a few flashbacks from the previous issues of the clues we were given, but we quite, couldn't put the pieces together. For instance, we see Ralph standing in the open grave, which is muddy. We now know why it was muddy. And of course, we know why the cats were licking his muddy shoes, which I guess are technically, they were mud, but it was created from the milkshake, so And I also mentioned that you have to keep an eye on the milkshake machine because every issue Homer wants a milkshake, but he can't get it because it's broken. Now we know why, because the pipe was damaged. And of course, when Krusty told Raphael to turn the pressure all the way to maximum, we see that it created kind of a geyser and it shot Comic Book Guy back up to the land of the living. Now, a confused Bart says, well, wait a minute, you dug up Comic Book Guy. He was all burned to a crisp like someone who just had a wrestling match with the Human Torch. And Lisa responds, that's because we dug up the wrong person. Comic Book Guy was in the next grave over, the one that was supposed to belong to none other than the graphic novel kid. She goes on to say that the graphic novel kid hated Comic Book Guy, and that actually he faked his own death by digging up the former Lard Lad mascot, and you can see they got him taped to the steering wheel, and using a bunch of props and equipment he bought from old movies on eBay, he actually used that to fake his own death. He then sent an email to Comic Book Guy, and I love this panel here because he says, a funeral for the actor that played the Horta in Star Trek episode number 25, The Devil in the Dark, and it's happening here in Springfield today? I am so there. I wish they would have threw in a little no-kill eye in there as well. Comic Book Guy shows up to the funeral and he says, where's everybody? I wore my best formal t-shirt. But, alas, he's confronted and he says, hello, my nemesis. I am not referring to the 10th Star Trek film. And he says, have I entered the mirror universe? A quick bonk on the head from the shovel and Comic Book Guy tumbles into the husky-sized coffin, seemingly to be buried alive. Now we see, well, it's technically graphic novel kid, stomp away here. And he says, I've been told in the past to get a life, now I will, yours. So we're going to get kind of a one-part identity theft, one-part insurance fraud, because you'll see in the next panel, we see the blue-haired lawyer. It says here, faking his own death was very profitable. Graphic novel kid had taken out a large insurance policy and made Comic Book Guy the sole beneficiary. And he says, are you sure you want it all in these cartoonish money bags? I could just wire it to your bank account. And technically, graphic novel kid responds, if they're good enough for Uncle Scrooge and Richie Rich, they're good enough for me. I couldn't agree more. We then see a flashback from the first issue where seemingly Comic Book Guy was outbidding all the other nerds for every piece of memorabilia, to which he then chases after the rocket, and we see him come to his, untimely demise. But we now know that actually wasn't Comic Book Guy, because it finishes off here, and graphic novel kid, who everyone now thought was Comic Book Guy, was buried next to Comic Book Guy, who was in graphic novel kid's grave. And you can see Chief Wiggum, ow, 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 my brain hurts. Do you have anything for the pain, Doc? Yes, read a book once in a while. So satisfied, Chief Wiggum announces, so the mystery is solved, but Lisa says, not at all. There's one big question remaining. Who was the graphic novel kid? And off panel we hear, I can answer that, Lady Lisa. It's Comic Book Guy. He goes on to explain that he was my nearly identical cousin. All right. And we get a flashback of the two as young kids, reading comic books, playing together, pretending to be superheroes. He goes on to say, as teens, we even attempted to give ourselves superpowers, but that led to tragedy. And Lisa interrupts and says, so that journal entry we read was true? And that's when he became your mortal enemy? And I love this next panel because he says, what? No. In fact, that sort of thing happened all the time. He says, you told the goth kid about our secret cave hideout? Now he'll tell everyone about my Green Lantern outfit. I love that. Not only is he dressed up, but this isn't actually the Joker. It's just a goth kid. So that was great. After a few more panels of kind of bickering back and forth, we see Comic Book Guy exiting the shop and he says, behold, the last copy left on the shelf of the latest Radioactive Man. And then the one where he finds out whether or not Dr. Crab is really his father. And he says, indeed, I can't wait to read that after you, pal. Sorry, but this is a rare collectible. It goes back into the Mylar bag after I'm done and straight into the dark closet. He says, but, no buts. It's time I got serious about collecting comics if I ever want to open up my own store one day. And graphic novel kid says, what means more to you, that comic book or our friendship? And then we see the two separate and seemingly say goodbye to one another. Which then Lisa responds, that's the saddest thing I've ever heard. And Comic Book Guy, I know, he was pathetic. And anyway, he always preferred horror comics to superheroes. I don't know why he was so upset. But enough of these flashbacks. It's time to return to my store. However, Bart informs him, yeah, about that. When Mom took over your shop, she made some changes. And, he says, well, how bad could it be? Yeah, that bad. And this part here always gets me here. He says, heart stopping, quickly, hand me the box behind the counter. And it's the Captain Marvel brand defibrillator, not a toy. He zaps himself with a classic Shazam, and he's all good. So he asks, where are all my comics? And Marge responds, all the violent and scary ones? I threw them all away. But she informs him that the recycling would only come for one box at a time, so the majority of them are still in the back alley. So of course he runs about back, and he begins to reread all his precious comics. As he's reading them, he looks down and discovers an issue of Tales from the Vampire Warlock's Creepy Grave of Terror. He states that this was Graphic Novel Kid's favorite comic book. And I'm going to go ahead and just leave this up for a moment here. You can pause it. This is the whole page. He reads this story. It's essentially in vein of classic, Tales from the Crypt, even with a nice ending of the pun, delivering Crypt Keeper at the bottom. But it's essentially the same exact thing that kind of happened between the two. So after he reads it, he gets, sentimental. And he says, he based my murder on his favorite comic book story? He must have really cared. I think there's somewhere I need to go. He visits the grave of Graphic Novel Kid, he has a picture in hand, and he says, I am and always will be your friend. Of course, add a live long and prosper, and you got yourself a little Wrath of Khan there. Now that the book is coming to a conclusion, Boothby takes a moment to kind of wrap up some of the loose ends. You remember there were a few side stories. For instance, we flash forward here to Nelson. You remember he kind of had that infatuation with Marge, having that motherly figure role. So now that the shop is under old management, he says, so what happens now? I don't work here anymore. Where will I go? What will I do? And of course, his bullies come back and they want him to come back because, all the nerds have gotten cocky since he's been gone. So he decides to go back and he says, would it be okay if I steal you a Mother's Day card every year? And Marge just says, just tell me which one and I'll go to the store and read it. So he wraps up that little storyline. And then he also wraps up Bart's side story, which is the hobby, because now that the store's back open, he doesn't need to knit. And he says as much. He says, the store is back. I can finally give up knitting. He throws it back, and the needles stick right in Skinner's butt. And Super Nintendo Chalmers comes in, and Skinner says, long story short, comic book guy's back, and he announces that everything's back to normal. As for comic book guy himself, he makes a statement. He says, and as for you kids, there are going to be some changes made. And we go to the next page and we see them outside of the Aztec Theater for Death of McBain. And Bart says, you're taking us all to the movies? Yes, maybe there was something to this whole concept you call friendship. I've decided to only be a sarcastic misanthrope 6 days a week. And as they watch the film, comic book guy gets increasingly more, agitated with the film, and finally he gets fed up. He says, oh, please, he's not really dead. This is all just a cheap, shameless publicity stunt and an insult to the intelligence of the audience. And Bart says, so what you're saying is this is the worst fake death ever. And the story comes to a conclusion with a very fitting panel, the classic comic book guy phrase, worst something ever. So I really like the way they ended that off there. And with that, we conclude issue number 5 of Death of Comic Book Guy. Now, the issue itself, as I mentioned, a lot more dialogue driven, which makes sense. I mean, you're wrapping up the story. You got to kind of explain how the death occurred, how he came back to life, those types of things. And of course, you're tying up some of the loose ends with some of the side stories. But it's still a very good issue, very funny. It has plenty of comedic relief. Very Simpsons-esque, and of course it ends with the worst fake death ever, essentially making fun of itself at the same time, so very fitting. As for the series itself, I really enjoyed it. It's very fun, not just because it's Simpsons, but, I like Comic Book Guy. He's one of my favorite characters in the show. It's kind of a shame that this is the only solo Comic Book Guy material out there. I would love to read another miniseries, maybe without him, dying, just seeing Jeff Albertson, aka Comic Book Guy, at the shop, in the real world, just doing things, interacting with the, residents of Springfield. I think that would be awesome. But nonetheless, I'm happy we at least have this. Now, I've talked about the writing. I love it. Boothby does a fantastic job from issue number 1. He did a great job of capturing the essence of The Simpsons from the cartoon and transferring it to another medium into, the actual art or the actual comic book itself. So you feel like you're reading an issue of The Simpsons. And another aspect that I haven't given Boothby a lot of credit on is it's about comic book guy, right? So obviously his world revolves around the geek culture. So when comic book guy is present, he makes all sorts of references: sci-fi, horror, video games, comic books, you name it. But he's only in issues number 1 and number 5. Yet Boothby does a great job of kind of capturing the essence of comic book guy because he makes so many more references, even though he's not in the book, but you feel like he's there. You know what I mean? You're still getting those pop culture references. So he does a really good job on that. As for the visual aspects of it, no complaints. Artwork is great, lettering is great, inks, everything it's very vibrant, it pops out. There's really nothing to complain about in this series. I mean, if I had to nitpick, I'd probably say, maybe like the side issues, the side stories. Bart's knitting, although provided some comedic relief, wasn't the greatest. Nelson's little infatuation, that's really nothing to complain about, seeing as it only took up like 3 pages total. Or something small like Marge's Little Rascal dream, same thing. It only took up like 2 pages, so it's not a big deal. But at least those revolved around comic book guy, or at least his absence. Bart had to get a new hobby because the comic book shop was gone. Marge had that dream because she's running the comic book store. Nelson was in the shop. The only real bugaboo that I probably have about this series is Homer's insult club. I mean, it's not that it wasn't funny. I mean, it has, funny elements to it, but it doesn't really add anything to the story. It's contained in one issue. It doesn't show up in the next issue at all. And I don't know, I hate to call it filler, but I feel like outside of issue number 2 and essentially Homer just adding in some punchlines here and there, he doesn't have much to do in the series. So I felt like they just had to add him in there and give him some page space. But at the end of the day, if that's the worst aspect of this miniseries, then that's pretty good, All in all, I really enjoyed the series. I definitely recommend it, not just if you're a Simpsons fan, but I think if you're involved in the geek culture, you'll really enjoy this. So definitely, if you get a chance, pick it up. There's plenty of panels and pages that I did not cover, so I hope it's enough for you to at least go out and be interested in it. And you won't regret it, I promise. Now, moving forward, I have some more content of another series that I want to cover, but I think I'm going to re-record it because I enjoy talking about, as much as I did the individual issues, I really enjoy talking about story arcs or miniseries or what have you as a whole, just because I feels more like a natural conversation as opposed to just doing one issue at a time. Now, there's going to be issues that warrant its own video, but moving forward, I think going as a whole will be better. Also, I won't be showing as many panels from the issues. I feel like as much as I showed in this, kind of takes away from you wanting to go out and read the book because, well, you've basically seen all you need to see. I mean, there are some other aspects to the story that you should read, but mostly got the gist of it. So I think this will be better moving forward on that. But I do have plenty of content already lined up. Got my marker board over here with some ideas I'm going to be popping out. So I'm going to get those up. I definitely want to get back to it. So I'm excited. Hopefully we can get things going again. Anyways, let me know what you think down in the comments. Do you like this series? Have you read it? Do you plan on reading it? Or just leave any comment at all. Let me know what you think. If you like this video, go ahead and like and subscribe so you know when the next one comes out. If you didn't like the video, I still appreciate you watching. So until we meet again, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.